The notification sound on my phone cut through the Austin morning air like a blade. I was standing in my East Austin apartment, still in my silk pajamas, holding a steaming cup of coffee and watching the sunrise paint the downtown skyline in shades of gold and amber. It was Tuesday, March 15th, 2023, and I had just closed the biggest deal in TechFlow Solutions history the night before. I should have been celebrating. Instead, I was about to discover just how quickly triumph can turn to devastation. The text was from Jake Morrison, my boyfriend of 2.5 years, the man I thought I'd be planning a future with. No call, no face-to-face conversation, just 12 words that would change everything. This isn't working anymore. We're too different. It's over. Take care. I stared at the screen, my coffee growing cold in my trembling hands. The words blurred as I read them again and again, searching for some hidden meaning, some indication that this was a cruel joke. But there was nothing. Just the cold, clinical dismissal of everything we'd built together, delivered with the same emotional detachment he might use to cancel a dentist appointment. My phone buzzed again. A follow-up message that made my stomach drop even further. "I'll have someone pack up your things from my place. Don't make this complicated." The audacity of it hit me like a physical blow. Don't make this complicated. As if I was some inconvenient problem to be managed, some loose end to be tied up. Efficiently, the man who had whispered that he loved me just 3 nights ago, who had held me close and talked about our dreams for the future, had just reduced our entire relationship to a logistical inconvenience. But here's what Jake Morrison didn't know, as he sent those texts, probably while sitting in his corner office at TechFlow Solutions, admiring his newly earned vice president of sales nameplate. He had no idea who he was really dismissing. He thought he was breaking up with Emma Chen, a quiet data analyst who worked in the background, crunching numbers and generating reports that helped drive his success. He thought he was cutting loose, someone who was useful but ultimately replaceable, someone who didn't quite fit into his vision of the polished, ambitious life he wanted to build. What he didn't know was that the company he worked for, the company that had just made him rich with bonuses from our latest client acquisition, the company where he strutted around like he owned the place, actually belonged to me. Every glass, wall, every conference room, every stock option he'd been bragging about to his fraternity brothers. It was all mine. And in exactly 48 hours, he was going to find out. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Let me start from the beginning, because the real story isn't just about revenge, though that part is satisfying. It's about understanding your worth when everyone around you seems determined to underestimate it. It's about the quiet power that comes from knowing exactly who you are, even when the world tries to tell you who you should be. And it's about the moment when you stop shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's idea of your life. My name is Emma Chen, and I'm 28 years old. To most people at TechFlow Solutions, I was just another face in the crowd. Someone who showed up early, stayed late, and produced consistently excellent work without making a fuss about it. I kept my head down, spoke up only when I had something valuable to contribute, and let my results speak for themselves. In a company full of big personalities and bigger egos, I was practically invisible. And that's exactly how I preferred it. You see, I learned early in life that there's tremendous power in being underestimated. When people don't see you as a threat, they reveal their true selves around you. They say things they shouldn't say, make decisions they wouldn't make if they knew you were paying attention, and treat you in ways that show you exactly who they really are beneath the polished exterior. Jake Morrison was a masterclass in this kind of revelation. I still remember the day he walked into TechFlow Solutions 18 months ago. It was a humid August morning, and the air conditioning in our downtown Austin office was struggling against the Texas heat. I was at my desk in the analytics department, surrounded by dual monitors displaying market trend data and customer behavior patterns, when I heard the commotion from the reception area. Jake Morrison, a confident voice, announced, and I looked up to see a tall man with perfectly styled dark hair and a smile that seemed designed to sell things. He was wearing a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he moved through the office with the kind of easy confidence that came from a lifetime of having doors opened for him. Our CEO, Margaret Hawkins, was giving him the full tour, and I watched from my corner workstation as they made their rounds. Jake had the kind of charisma that drew people in instantly. He remembered names, asked thoughtful questions, and had a way of making whoever he was talking to feel like the most important person in the room. By the time they reached the analytics department, half the office was already charmed. "And this is our data analytics team," Margaret said, gesturing toward our section. "They're the ones who turn raw information into actionable insights that drive our client strategies." Jake's eyes swept across our department, and when they landed on me, something shifted in his expression. Not the calculated charm he'd been displaying for everyone else, but something more genuine. Something that looked like actual interest. "Emma Chen," I said, standing up and extending my hand when Margaret introduced us. His handshake was firm, warm, and lasted just a moment longer than strictly professional. "The pleasure's all mine," he said. And for a split second, I forgot that I was supposed to be the quiet, invisible analyst. There was something about the way he looked at me, like he was seeing something others missed, that made me feel suddenly visible in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. That should have been my first warning sign. Jake Morrison was hired as Vice President of Sales, tasked with expanding our client base and increasing revenue. He was good at his job. I'll give him that. Within 6 months, he'd landed 3 major accounts and increased our quarterly sales by 37%. He had a gift for reading people, for understanding what they wanted to hear and delivering it with just the right mix of confidence and sincerity. What I didn't realize at the time was that he was reading me too, calculating exactly how to position himself to get what he wanted. Our first official date was 3 weeks after he started at TechFlow. He'd been finding excuses to stop by my desk, asking questions about market analytics and customer behavior patterns that went just slightly beyond what his role required. At first, I thought he was genuinely interested in understanding the technical side of our business. Later, I realized he was building a foundation of knowledge that would help him take credit for insights that weren't his own. But that October evening, as we sat across from each other at a cozy restaurant in South Austin, none of those red flags were visible yet. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely fascinated by my work in ways that no one else had ever been. He asked thoughtful questions about data modeling and predictive analytics, and when I explained complex concepts, he listened with the kind of focus that made me feel like my expertise actually mattered. "You're brilliant," he said at one point, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "I don't think people at the office really understand how valuable your insights are." I felt a flush of warmth at the compliment. In a world where my contributions were often overlooked or absorbed into team achievements without individual recognition, having someone acknowledge my specific value felt like discovering water in a desert. "I just like solving puzzles," I said, trying to downplay the praise in the way I'd been taught was modest and appropriate. "Finding patterns in data that tell us something meaningful about human behavior." "That's exactly what I mean," Jake said, his eyes lighting up with what seemed like genuine admiration. "You see things others miss. You're going to be incredibly successful." Looking back now, I can see how carefully he was positioning himself. He wasn't just complimenting my intelligence. He was establishing himself as the person who truly understood and appreciated my potential. He was creating a narrative where he was my champion, my advocate, the one person who saw my worth when others didn't. It was a masterful manipulation, and I fell for it completely. Our relationship developed slowly over the following months. Jake was patient, attentive, and seemed to genuinely enjoy my company. He would pick me up after work and take me to galleries in the Arts District, or we'd spend weekends exploring food trucks and live music venues around Austin. He introduced me to his friends, a collection of polished professionals who worked in finance and tech, and he always presented me with obvious pride. "This is Emma," he would say, his arm around my waist. "She's the data genius I've been telling you about." I loved being seen that way, loved being acknowledged for my intelligence rather than just my ability to blend into the background. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was part of something bigger, like I belonged in spaces where important decisions were made and influential people gathered. What I didn't notice was how Jake was slowly positioning himself to benefit from my expertise. It started small. He'd ask for my input on client presentations, seeking my insights into market trends and consumer behavior. I was happy to help, flattered that he valued my analysis and wanted to incorporate it into his work. "You're making me look like a rock star out there," he'd say after a successful client meeting, pulling me close and kissing my forehead. "I don't know what I'd do without your brilliant brain." I glowed under the praise, not realizing that he was quite literally building his reputation on my uncredited contributions. The insights I shared over dinner conversations and lazy Sunday mornings were being repackaged and presented as his own strategic thinking. The market analysis I provided was becoming the foundation for sales presentations that earned him recognition and bonuses. By the time I started to notice the pattern, I was already in too deep emotionally to see it clearly. It was subtle at first. Jake would mention a strategy or insight in meetings that sounded remarkably similar to something I'd explained to him days earlier. When I brought it up privately, he'd seem genuinely confused. "Of course it sounds familiar," he'd say with a laugh. "We talk about this stuff all the time. Great minds think alike, right?" He had a way of making me feel like I was being overly sensitive, like I was reading too much into innocent coincidences. And maybe I was. Maybe I was just being paranoid, letting my natural tendency towards self-doubt cloud my judgment. The problem was, Jake was very good at making me doubt myself while simultaneously making me feel special. He had perfected the art of emotional manipulation disguised as devotion. He would build me up in private, telling me how brilliant and valuable I was, and then subtly undermine my confidence in professional settings. In meetings, he would interrupt me mid-sentence to build on my ideas, effectively taking ownership of them while making it seem like he was being collaborative. He would ask me to prepare analysis for presentations and then present the findings without mentioning my role in developing them. When I tried to speak up more assertively, he would later pull me aside with concern. "You seemed a little aggressive in there," he'd say, his voice gentle but worried. "I know you're passionate about the work, but you might want to dial it back a bit." Some of the senior leadership doesn't respond well to that kind of intensity from junior staff. It was gaslighting disguised as career advice, and it was devastatingly effective. I began to second-guess myself constantly, wondering if I was being too pushy, too demanding, too visible. I started pulling back, returning to my comfortable position in the background, letting Jake be the face of strategies that were built on my analysis. The worst part was that I thought I was doing it for us. I convinced myself that Jake's success was our success, that supporting him was an investment in our shared future. I told myself that relationships required sacrifice, that love meant lifting each other up even when it meant stepping back yourself. I was so busy trying to be the perfect supportive girlfriend that I completely missed the fact that support was flowing in only one direction. The breaking point should have been last month, during the Meridian Industries presentation. We'd been courting this client for 6 months, and landing them would be the biggest deal in TechFlow's history. The presentation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, and Jake had been stressed about it for weeks. On the Sunday before, we were having brunch at a trendy spot in East Austin, and Jake was pacing around my apartment afterward, rehearsing his pitch. I could see he was nervous, which was unusual for him. Jake Morrison was many things, but uncertain wasn't typically one of them. "What if they ask about the long-term market projections?" he said, running his hands through his hair. I mean, I have the data, but some of those trend analyses are pretty complex. I set down my coffee and looked at him thoughtfully. I'd been tracking Meridian Industries for months, analyzing their market position and identifying opportunities for growth. I knew their business model better than most of their own executives probably did. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The employees who had stayed loyal during the lean times became the foundation of a company culture that attracted top talent, even when larger corporations offered higher salaries. By the time I graduated college in 2017, TechFlow Solutions had become one of Austin's most respected digital marketing firms. Uncle David had built something special. A company that proved you could be both profitable and principled, both innovative and ethical. That's when he made a decision that would change my life forever, though I wouldn't understand its full implications, for several years. "I want you to come work here full-time," he said over dinner at our favorite Vietnamese restaurant in East Austin. "But not as my niece. As an employee who earns her place through merit." I was thrilled by the opportunity, but also nervous about the potential complications of working for family. Uncle David seemed to read my concerns. "I'm not offering you this job because we're related," he said, his voice serious. "I'm offering it because you're the most naturally gifted data analyst I've ever worked with. You see patterns that others miss, and you understand the human stories behind the numbers. TechFlow needs that perspective." He paused, then continued with something that seemed like careful consideration of his words. "But Emma, I need you to promise me something. Whatever happens, whatever direction this company goes, remember that its real value isn't in the technology or the client contracts. It's in the people and the principles. Don't let anyone convince you that success requires compromising who you are." I promised, though I didn't understand why he seemed so concerned about future compromises. Uncle David was still young, barely 45, and TechFlow was more successful than ever. The idea that anything might threaten the company's values seemed impossible. I started as a junior data analyst, despite my mathematics degree and years of informal experience with the company. Uncle David insisted I earn my promotions through demonstrated results rather than family connections, and I was grateful for that approach. It meant that when I did advance, my colleagues knew it was because of my contributions rather than nepotism. The work was challenging and rewarding in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was developing predictive models for client campaigns, identifying market opportunities through demographic analysis, and creating data visualization tools that helped our clients understand their customers better. My reports were being used to drive strategic decisions for companies throughout Texas and beyond. Uncle David was an excellent mentor, but he was also careful to maintain professional boundaries during work hours. He treated me exactly the same as any other employee, which earned me respect from colleagues who might otherwise have been resentful of perceived favoritism. But our family relationship also gave me insights into Uncle David's thinking that other employees didn't have. During our occasional dinners together, he would share his concerns about industry trends and his hopes for TechFlow's future. "The marketing industry is changing," he told me one evening, about 6 months after I'd started working there full-time. "There's more money flowing into it, which means more people who see it as a path to quick profits rather than a service to help. Businesses grow. We're going to have to be very careful about maintaining our values as the industry gets more competitive." He was already thinking about succession planning, though he was far too young for retirement. Uncle David had always been a long-term, strategic thinker, someone who planned for contingencies that others never considered. "I want TechFlow to outlast me," he said. "I want it to continue helping businesses grow and supporting employees long after I'm gone. That means building systems and leadership structures that can maintain our culture, even if the original founder isn't here to guide them." These conversations seemed abstract at the time, interesting philosophical discussions about business, ethics, and long-term planning. I had no idea that Uncle David was already making concrete legal arrangements to ensure TechFlow's future aligned with his values. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in September 2019. I arrived at the office to find Uncle David's assistant, Maria, looking worried and distracted. Uncle David hadn't come in yet, which was unusual since he was typically the first person in the building every morning. "He didn't answer his phone this morning," Maria told me quietly. "That's not like him at all." By noon, we were genuinely concerned. Uncle David was one of the most reliable people I'd ever known, someone who would call if he was going to be even 15 minutes late. When he still hadn't arrived or responded to messages by 2 o'clock, Maria and I decided to drive to his house. We found him collapsed in his kitchen, still in his running clothes from his morning jog. The paramedics said it was a massive heart attack, sudden and devastating. He was 46 years old, had no history of heart problems, and had been in excellent physical condition. Sometimes, they told us, these things just happen. Uncle David died on the way to the hospital, and with him went the heart and soul of TechFlow Solutions. The funeral was overwhelming in ways I hadn't expected. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects, not just family and friends, but clients, employees, competitors, and business leaders from across Austin's tech community. Speaker after speaker talked about Uncle David's integrity, his generosity, his vision for ethical business practices in an industry that often rewarded ruthless competition over principled leadership. But what struck me most was how many people mentioned the positive impact TechFlow had made on their lives and businesses. Small business owners talked about how Uncle David's marketing strategies had helped them compete with major corporations. Employees shared stories about how he'd supported them through personal crises and professional challenges. Competitors admitted that Uncle David had set a standard for ethical practices that had elevated the entire industry. I realized that Uncle David hadn't just built a successful company. He'd created a legacy of positive impact that extended far beyond TechFlow's direct business operations. The weeks following the funeral were chaotic in ways I hadn't anticipated. Uncle David had been the sole owner of TechFlow Solutions, and his sudden death left the company's ownership structure unclear. Our legal team was scrambling to understand his estate planning, while employees worried about job security and clients questioned whether TechFlow could continue operating without its founder. Margaret Hawkins, who had been Uncle David's vice president of operations, stepped in as interim CEO. She was competent and well-respected, but she lacked Uncle David's visionary leadership and natural charisma. More importantly, she didn't have ownership stake in the company, which meant she couldn't make long-term strategic decisions without approval from whoever would inherit Uncle David's shares. I assumed that ownership would transfer to Uncle David's parents, my grandparents, who would probably sell the company to the highest bidder. The thought of TechFlow being absorbed by some larger corporation, stripped of its culture and values for the sake of efficiency and profit margins, was heartbreaking. For 3 months, we operated in legal limbo. Margaret did her best to maintain stability, but without clear ownership structure. We couldn't pursue new major clients or make significant investments in technology and personnel. "What if I walked you through the whole market landscape?" I offered. "I could break down the demographic shifts, the technological trends, the competitive pressures, give you a complete picture so you're ready for any question they might throw at you." Jake's face lit up with relief. "You'd do that? That would be incredible, Em. You're a lifesaver." We spent the next 4 hours going through everything. I explained the market dynamics, the consumer behavior patterns, the economic factors that would drive Meridian's growth over the next 5 years. I gave him insights that hadn't been included in any official reports, observations that came from months of deep analysis and industry research. Jake took notes, asked smart follow-up questions, and by the end of the afternoon, he had a comprehensive understanding of market forces that would position him as a true strategic thinker rather than just a smooth-talking salesman. "You're amazing," he said as we finished up, pulling me into his arms. "Seriously, Emma, Your brain is just incredible. I'm so lucky to have you. The presentation was a massive success. Jake delivered a pitch that was sophisticated, insightful, and perfectly tailored to Meridian's specific needs and challenges. He fielded complex questions about market trends and competitive positioning with the kind of expertise that impressed even our most senior executives. Margaret Hawkins called it the best sales presentation she'd seen in 15 years. Jake got a promotion to senior vice president and a bonus that was larger than my annual salary. At the celebration dinner, he was the star of the evening, graciously accepting congratulations and praise for his strategic brilliance. I sat at the table, smiling and applauding, waiting for him to acknowledge my contribution, waiting for him to mention the hours of analysis, the market insights, the strategic framework that had made his success possible. He never did. Not that night. Not in the follow-up meetings, not in the company newsletter that featured his achievement. I had become completely invisible, despite being the architect of his triumph. That's when I started to see Jake Morrison clearly for the first time. Not the charming, supportive boyfriend who believed in my potential, but the calculating opportunist who had been systematically mining my expertise for his own advancement. The realization should have been devastating, but instead, it was clarifying. Because Jake had made one crucial miscalculation in his assessment of quiet, invisible Emma Chen. He thought he knew who I was, but he had no idea what I was capable of. And as I sat in my apartment that Tuesday morning, staring at his dismissive breakup text, I realized it was time to show him exactly what he'd just thrown away. The truth about who I really was began with my Uncle David, though I didn't understand its significance until much later. Uncle David Chen wasn't just my father's younger brother. He was the kind of man who saw possibilities where others saw problems, who built dreams out of spare parts and determination. In 2008, while the rest of the world was watching financial markets collapse, Uncle David was in his garage in East Austin, surrounded by mismatched computer equipment and whiteboards covered in algorithms that would eventually revolutionize digital marketing. He'd been working as a software engineer for a major corporation, but he had a vision for something bigger, something that would help small businesses compete with major corporations through smart data analytics and targeted marketing strategies. I was 16 then, a quiet kid who spent more time with computers than people, and Uncle David's garage became my sanctuary. While my classmates were at parties or football games, I was learning about database architecture and consumer behavior, modeling from a man who spoke about technology like poetry. "Look at this, Em," he'd say, pointing to streams of data flowing across his monitors. Every click, every purchase, every moment someone spends looking at a website tells us a story. We're not just analyzing numbers, we're understanding human dreams and fears and desires. Uncle David taught me that data wasn't cold or impersonal. It was the digital fingerprint of human emotion, the mathematical expression of what people truly wanted versus what they claimed to want. Under his guidance, I learned to read those patterns like others read novels, finding narrative threads and character development in spreadsheets and algorithms. TechFlow Solutions started as David Chen's one-man operation, but it grew rapidly. His approach to digital marketing was revolutionary for its time, combining sophisticated data analysis with genuine understanding of human psychology. Instead of bombarding people with generic advertisements, TechFlow created targeted campaigns that felt personal and relevant. By the time I graduated high school, Uncle David had moved the company out of his garage and into a small office space downtown. He had 3 employees and a client list that included some of Austin's most innovative startups. But more importantly, he had something that would become increasingly rare in the business world: a genuine commitment to ethical practices and employee well-being. "Money follows purpose, not the other way around," he used to tell me. "Build something that actually helps people, treat your team like family, and success becomes inevitable." I believed him completely, partly because I'd watched him live those principles, but mostly because Uncle David was the most genuinely decent person I'd ever known. He paid his employees above market rates, offered comprehensive benefits when most small companies couldn't afford to, and made business decisions based on long-term relationships rather than short-term profits. When I started college at UT Austin, majoring in applied mathematics with a focus on statistical analysis, I spent my summers and winter breaks working at TechFlow. Uncle David insisted I start at the bottom, learning every aspect of the business from client relations to technical infrastructure. "You can't lead what you don't understand," he said, handing me a stack of customer service logs during my first summer internship. "Learn how our clients think, what frustrates them, what makes them successful. That knowledge will be worth more than any MBA." He was right, though I didn't fully appreciate it at the time. Those summers taught me that business success wasn't just about having the best technology or the smartest strategies. It was about understanding people, building trust, and consistently delivering value in ways that made clients feel heard and supported. Uncle David also taught me about resilience, in ways I wouldn't fully understand until years later. The 2008 financial crisis hit small businesses particularly hard, and TechFlow lost several major clients almost overnight. I watched Uncle David mortgage his house to keep the company running and continue paying his employees' salaries even when his own paycheck disappeared for months. "This is temporary," he told me during one particularly difficult evening, when we were working late trying to restructure client contracts. "Markets recover, but reputation and relationships last forever. We take care of our people now, and they'll take care of us when things turn around." He was right about that too. When the economy stabilized, TechFlow not only survived, but thrived. The clients who had been forced to cut their marketing budgets came back, bringing referrals. With them, several of our best employees started looking for other opportunities, worried that TechFlow might not survive the transition. That's when Ms. Rodriguez, Uncle David's estate attorney, called to schedule a meeting with me. I assumed she wanted to discuss my uncle's personal effects or perhaps my role in whatever transition was coming. I had no idea that Uncle David had spent years crafting a legal structure that would ensure TechFlow's future aligned with his values, regardless of what happened to him personally. Ms. Rodriguez's office was in a sleek high-rise in downtown Austin with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city. She was a sharp professional woman in her 50s, with the kind of precise manner that suggested extensive experience with complex legal arrangements. "Thank you for coming, Emma," she said, gesturing for me to sit across from her desk. "I know this has been a difficult time for you and everyone at TechFlow." I nodded, still uncertain why I was there. Ms. Rodriguez opened a thick folder and pulled out several legal documents. "Your uncle was very specific about his wishes regarding TechFlow Solutions. He spent considerable time and resources creating a legal structure that would protect the company's culture and values after his death." She handed me the first document, and I nearly dropped it when I read the header, "Irrevocable Trust Agreement for TechFlow Solutions, LLC." "I don't understand," I said, scanning the dense legal language. Ms. Rodriguez smiled gently. "Your uncle established a trust that holds controlling interest in TechFlow Solutions. According to the terms of that trust, ownership transfers to you on your 28th birthday, provided you meet certain criteria related to your education, professional experience, and commitment to the company's stated values." I stared at her, certain I'd misunderstood. "You're saying Uncle David left me the company?" 85% of it, yes. The remaining 15% is held in an employee stock ownership plan that your uncle established to ensure long-term staff retention and alignment with company goals. The implications hit me like a physical force. Uncle David hadn't just left me a business. He'd entrusted me with his life's work, his vision for ethical business practices, and the livelihoods of 37 employees who had become like family to him. "Why didn't he tell me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. David was very clear about his reasoning. He wanted you to learn the business from the ground up, to understand every aspect of operations, and to earn the respect of your colleagues based on your own merits, rather than your inheritance. He also wanted you to see how the company functioned under different leadership styles, so you'd be prepared to maintain its culture when you took control. She handed me another document, this one a letter in Uncle David's handwriting. He wrote this for you to read when the trust transferred ownership. He was very specific that you should read it privately, when you had time to process everything he's telling you. I took the letter with trembling hands, but didn't open it immediately. The weight of what I'd just learned was overwhelming. For the past 3 months, I'd been mourning not just the loss of my uncle, but the anticipated destruction of everything he'd built. Now I was discovering that he'd planned for this contingency, that he'd structured the company's future around his belief in my ability to carry forward his vision. "When does the trust transfer?" I asked. Ms. Rodriguez checked her calendar. "Your 28th birthday is in 6 weeks. On that date, you'll become the controlling owner of TechFlow Solutions with full authority to make strategic and operational decisions." 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, I would go from being a mid-level data analyst to owning one of Austin's most successful digital marketing firms. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. "What happens if I don't want the responsibility?" I asked. "The trust includes provisions for that scenario," Ms. Rodriguez said. "If you decline ownership, the company would be sold and the proceeds donated to several charities that your uncle supported. But Emma, he was very confident that you would accept the responsibility. He believed you were the only person who truly understood both the technical and ethical foundations of what he'd built." I thought about Uncle David's conversations over the years, his emphasis on values-based leadership and long-term thinking. All those discussions about maintaining company culture and resisting industry pressures toward unethical practices suddenly made perfect sense. He hadn't been speaking philosophically. He'd been preparing me for the responsibility he knew I would eventually inherit. The meeting lasted another hour as Ms. Rodriguez walked me through the legal details and timeline for the ownership transfer. I would need to review extensive documentation, meet with TechFlow's board of advisors, and develop a strategic plan for the company's future direction. But the most important moment came when I was alone in my car afterward, finally opening Uncle David's letter. "Emma," it began in his familiar handwriting, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're about to inherit something much bigger than a business. You're inheriting a responsibility to prove that companies can be both profitable and principled, that success doesn't require compromising your values or exploiting your employees. I know this is overwhelming, and I know you probably have doubts about your readiness for this responsibility. But I've watched you grow from that quiet teenager in my garage into a brilliant analyst and natural leader. You have the technical skills, the ethical foundation, and the emotional intelligence to not just maintain what I've built, but to expand it in ways I never could have imagined. The business world will try to convince you that nice guys finish last, that success requires ruthless competition and moral flexibility. Don't believe it. Our success at TechFlow proves that treating people well, delivering genuine value, and maintaining integrity are not just ethical imperatives, they're competitive advantages. You'll face challenges I never had to deal with. The industry is changing rapidly, and there will be pressure to compromise our values for short-term gains. There will be people who underestimate you because of your age, your gender, or your quiet leadership style. Use that underestimation to your advantage. Let them reveal their true character while you build something stronger and more sustainable than they can imagine. Most importantly, remember that TechFlow's real value isn't in our technology or our client contracts. It's in our people and our principles. Protect both, and everything else will follow. I love you, and I believe in you completely. Uncle David. Sitting in that parking garage, reading his final words to me, I felt something shift inside me. The grief was still there, but it was joined by something else: determination. Uncle David had spent years preparing me for this moment, and I wasn't going to let him down. But I also wasn't going to announce my inheritance immediately. Uncle David had been right about the value of being underestimated. For the next 6 weeks, I would continue working as a data analyst, observing how the company functioned under uncertainty, learning which employees were truly committed to our values and which were simply waiting for better opportunities. More importantly, I would get to see how potential new leadership might handle the responsibility Uncle David had entrusted to me. I had no idea that this period of observation would coincide with Jake Morrison's arrival at TechFlow, or that his behavior over the following months would provide the perfect case study in exactly the kind of leadership Uncle David had warned me against. But that's exactly what happened. And by the time Jake sent me that devastating breakup text, I had spent 18 months watching him reveal his true character in ways that would make my next decision incredibly easy. The quiet, invisible data analyst he thought he was discarding was about to become his boss. And unlike him, I had actually earned that position. My 28th birthday fell on a quiet Thursday in November, 3 days after Jake Morrison had joined TechFlow Solutions. I woke up that morning in my East Austin apartment, sunlight streaming through the windows, knowing that this ordinary-seeming day would fundamentally change my life. In a few hours, I would legally become the owner of the company where I'd been working as just another employee for the past 2 years. But instead of celebrating, I found myself thinking about Jake's first week at TechFlow and how his presence had already begun to shift the office dynamics in subtle but unmistakable ways. Ms. Rodriguez had scheduled our meeting for that afternoon, when she would officially transfer ownership and provide me with all the documentation I needed to assume control of TechFlow Solutions. Until that moment, only she, Patricia Wells the trustee, and I knew about my inheritance. To everyone else at the company, including Margaret Hawkins, who was still serving as interim CEO, I was simply Emma Chen, the data analyst who worked quietly, in the corner, and produced consistently excellent reports. I had spent weeks agonizing over when and how to reveal my new role. The straightforward approach would be to announce it immediately, call an all-hands meeting, and transition into leadership, with transparency and clarity. But Uncle David's letter kept echoing in my mind, particularly his advice about using underestimation to my advantage, and learning people's true character before revealing my position of power. Jake Morrison's arrival had crystallized my decision to wait. From his very first day, Jake had displayed a combination of charm and calculation that reminded me of everything Uncle David had warned me about regarding the changing nature of our industry. He was undeniably talented, with an impressive track record of sales success and strategic thinking that could genuinely benefit TechFlow. But there was something about the way he operated that set off alarm bells in my mind. During his first week, I watched Jake systematically work the room, identifying key players and potential allies with the precision of a chess master. He remembered personal details about everyone he met, asked thoughtful questions about their roles and responsibilities, and seemed genuinely interested in understanding TechFlow's culture and operations. But I also noticed how his behavior varied depending on who he was talking to. With Margaret Hawkins and other senior leaders, he was deferential and eager to learn, positioning himself as a valuable addition to the leadership team. With mid-level managers, he was collaborative and strategic, suggesting improvements and offering insights from his previous experience. With junior employees, he was friendly but slightly patronizing, treating them as sources of information rather than potential colleagues. And with me, his approach was different altogether. Jake had clearly identified me as someone worth cultivating, but not because he saw me as a threat or a peer. Instead, he seemed to recognize that I had access to valuable information and insights that could help him succeed at TechFlow. From our very first conversation, he treated me like a resource to be mined rather than a colleague to be respected. "Emma, right?" he had said, stopping by my desk during his second day. "Margaret mentioned that you're our data analytics expert. I'd love to pick your brain sometime about market trends and customer behavior patterns." His smile was warm and engaging, but there was something calculated about the way he positioned the request. He wasn't asking for my professional opinion as an equal. He was expressing interest in extracting my knowledge for his own purposes. "I'd be happy to help," I had replied, maintaining the polite but reserved demeanor I'd cultivated over my years at TechFlow. "What specific areas are you most interested in?" "Everything, really," Jake said with a laugh that was designed to be disarming. "I want to understand how you see the market evolving, what opportunities you think we might be missing, how we could better serve our existing clients. You know, the kind of insights that only come from really deep analysis." It was a fishing expedition disguised as intellectual curiosity, and I recognized it immediately. Jake wasn't interested in collaborating with me or building on my expertise. He wanted to absorb my knowledge and present it as his own strategic thinking. Over the following days, I watched Jake repeat this pattern with other employees. He would approach people with apparent humility and eagerness to learn, asking questions that seemed designed to understand their expertise and responsibilities. But he was also clearly mapping the organizational structure, identifying who held real influence versus who simply held titles, and determining which relationships would be most valuable for his own advancement. The most telling moment came during his first team meeting with the sales department. Jake had been brought in to revitalize our client acquisition efforts, and Margaret had asked him to present his initial assessment and strategic recommendations to the existing sales team. I wasn't technically part of that meeting, but I had been asked to provide market data and competitive analysis to support the discussion. As I sat in the back of the conference room, listening to Jake present his vision for expanding TechFlow's client base, I was struck by how skillfully he balanced confidence with collaboration. "I've spent my first week here learning about the incredible work you've all been doing," he began, making eye contact with each team member as he spoke. "TechFlow has built something really special, and I'm not here to tear down what's working. I'm here to build on your successes and help us reach even bigger goals." It was exactly the right tone, acknowledging the existing team's contributions while positioning himself as an amplifier rather than a replacement. But as Jake continued his presentation, I began to notice how he was subtly repositioning ideas and strategies that other people had developed. Sarah from business development had spent months researching expansion opportunities in the healthcare sector, identifying potential clients, and developing targeted marketing strategies. Jake referenced this work in his presentation, but framed it as validation of his own strategic thinking rather than building on Sarah's research. Kevin from account management had proposed a client retention program that focused on long-term relationship building rather than short-term sales targets. Jake incorporated this concept into his recommendations, but presented it as his own insight into sustainable revenue growth. Most troubling of all, Jake referenced market analysis that was clearly based on reports I had prepared over the past 6 months, but he presented the insights as conclusions he had reached through his own research and experience. None of it was technically plagiarism, since these ideas had been shared in team meetings and collaborative discussions. But there was something deeply unsettling about how Jake absorbed other people's work and repackaged it as evidence of his own expertise and leadership potential. After the meeting, I lingered in the conference room, ostensibly organizing my materials, but actually observing how Jake interacted with individual team members. His approach was masterful in its manipulation. He made each person feel valued and heard, asking follow-up questions about their ideas and expressing enthusiasm for their contributions. But he was also establishing himself as the central coordinator of all these efforts, the person who could synthesize everyone's individual expertise into coherent strategic direction. By the end of those conversations, Jake had positioned himself as indispensable to the team's success, while simultaneously diminishing everyone else's individual contributions. That evening, As I sat in my apartment processing what I had observed, I realized that Jake Morrison represented exactly the kind of leader Uncle David had warned me about. He was talented, charismatic, and strategically minded, but his success was built on exploitation rather than genuine value creation. He understood how to extract and repackage other people's work, how to position himself as the indispensable center of collaborative efforts, and how to advance his own career while making others feel grateful for the opportunity to contribute to his success. The most insidious part of Jake's approach was that it worked. Over his first few weeks at TechFlow, he quickly established himself as a rising star within the organization. Margaret Hawkins clearly saw him as a potential successor to Uncle David's visionary leadership, and other senior managers were impressed by his strategic thinking and collaborative approach. But I could see what they couldn't. Jake wasn't building anything new or innovative. He was simply very good at identifying valuable ideas that other people had developed and presenting them in ways that enhanced his own reputation and influence. This realization crystallized my decision to delay revealing my ownership of TechFlow. I wanted to observe Jake's behavior over a longer period, to see how he operated when he thought he was dealing with people who had no power to challenge his methods. I wanted to understand exactly what kind of leader he would become if given the opportunity to advance within the organization. More importantly, I wanted to see how he would treat me personally as our professional relationship evolved. Jake had clearly identified me as a valuable resource, someone whose expertise could accelerate his success at TechFlow, but he had also positioned our interactions in a way that suggested he saw me as subordinate rather than equal, useful rather than threatening. I was curious to see how that dynamic would develop if I allowed him to believe he had successfully established dominance over me. The afternoon of my 28th birthday, I met with Ms. Rodriguez to complete the ownership transfer. Her office felt different this time, less intimidating and more like the headquarters of my new responsibility. She walked me through stacks of documents that officially made me the controlling owner of TechFlow Solutions, explaining my legal obligations and the various mechanisms Uncle David had put in place to protect the company's culture and values. "You have complete authority to make strategic and operational decisions," she explained, handing me the final signature page. "But the trust also includes provisions that protect employee rights and ensure the company maintains its commitment to ethical business practices." I signed my name with steady hands, feeling the weight of Uncle David's legacy settling on my shoulders. In that moment, I officially became responsible for 37 employees, 12 major clients, and a company culture that had taken Uncle David 15 years to build. "When do you plan to announce the transition?" Ms. Rodriguez asked. "I'm not sure yet," I replied honestly. "I want to observe the current dynamics for a while longer. Make sure I understand how the company is really functioning before I change the power structure." Ms. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "Your uncle would have made the same choice. He always believed in understanding a situation completely before taking action." That evening, I celebrated my birthday quietly at home, ordering takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and sitting on my balcony overlooking the Austin skyline. Somewhere out there, Jake Morrison was probably having drinks with his new colleagues, continuing to build the relationships and influence that he thought would secure his future at TechFlow. He had no idea that his future was now entirely in my hands. Over the following weeks, I maintained my routine as a data analyst while privately beginning to exercise my authority as owner. I met with Patricia Wells, the trustee, to review TechFlow's financial performance and strategic positioning. I scheduled confidential meetings with our accountants and legal advisors to understand the company's obligations and opportunities. I even began reaching out to Uncle David's network of business contacts, identifying potential partnerships and growth opportunities that I could pursue once I revealed my role. But during office hours, I remained invisible Emma Chen, the quiet analyst who produced excellent work and stayed out of office politics. This dual existence gave me unprecedented insight into how TechFlow was really functioning in the months after Uncle David's death. Margaret Hawkins was doing her best to maintain stability, but she lacked the vision and charisma that had made Uncle David such an effective leader. More concerning, she was increasingly relying on Jake Morrison's strategic input and collaborative approach, without recognizing the ways he was gradually centralizing power and influence around himself. Jake, meanwhile, was systematically building his position within the organization. He had established himself as the go-to person for strategic thinking and client relations, making himself indispensable to Margaret while simultaneously cultivating relationships with key employees throughout the company. And he was paying particular attention to me. Our professional interactions had evolved into a pattern that was both flattering and deeply manipulative. Jake would regularly stop by my desk to ask for insights and analysis, always framing his requests in ways that made me feel valued and important. He remembered details about my work, asked thoughtful follow-up questions, and expressed genuine enthusiasm for my expertise. But he was also gradually establishing a dynamic where I was providing intellectual labor that enhanced his reputation and advancement opportunities. The market analyses I shared with him would appear in his presentations to senior leadership. The client insights I developed would inform his strategic recommendations. The competitive research I conducted would support his proposals for new business initiatives. Jake was very careful to acknowledge my contributions in private, always thanking me for my help and expressing appreciation for my expertise. But in public settings, he presented my work as validation of his own strategic thinking, rather than collaboration with a colleague. The pattern became so consistent that I started documenting it, keeping detailed records of our conversations, and tracking how my insights were being incorporated into Jake's professional presentations. I told myself it was simple intellectual curiosity, a way to understand how manipulation and exploitation functioned in professional settings. But the truth was more personal than that. I was beginning to understand how Uncle David's warnings about industry changes weren't just philosophical concerns. They were practical predictions about the kind of people who would be attracted to successful companies like TechFlow. Jake Morrison represented a new generation of business leaders who understood that success could be achieved through strategic positioning and personal branding, rather than genuine innovation or value creation. He was very good at identifying opportunities to enhance his own reputation and advancement, and he was equally skilled at convincing other people to contribute to his success while feeling grateful for the opportunity. The most troubling part was that Jake's approach was working. Within 2 months of joining TechFlow, he had established himself as Margaret Hawkins' most trusted advisor and the obvious candidate for promotion to senior leadership. His colleagues respected his strategic thinking and collaborative approach, unaware that much of his success was built on repackaging other people's ideas and expertise. And I was enabling his success by continuing to provide insights and analysis that enhanced his reputation, even as I recognized exactly what he was doing. This contradiction came to a head during the development of our proposal for Meridian Industries, the client that would eventually become TechFlow's biggest success story. Jake had been tasked with leading the pitch development, and he had approached me for market analysis and competitive intelligence that would inform our strategic approach. I spent weeks developing comprehensive research on Meridian's industry, position, customer base, and growth opportunities. I identified market trends that suggested optimal timing for expansion, demographic shifts that would create new revenue opportunities, and technological developments that could give Meridian competitive advantages over their rivals. My analysis was sophisticated, thorough, and directly relevant to Meridian's strategic challenges. It was also the kind of insight that could only come from months of deep research and industry expertise. Jake incorporated my research into his presentation materials, but he presented it as evidence of his own strategic thinking, rather than collaboration with TechFlow's analytics team. When Margaret Hawkins praised the sophistication of his market analysis, Jake accepted the credit graciously, mentioning only briefly that he had consulted with our analytics department to validate his conclusions. Watching Jake present my Work as his own insight was infuriating, but it was also clarifying. I finally understood exactly what kind of person he was and how he operated. More importantly, I understood that his success was built entirely on exploiting other people's expertise while positioning himself as the indispensable coordinator of their efforts. That evening, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. Instead of confronting Jake about his appropriation of my work, I decided to provide him with even more valuable insights and analysis. I would give him enough rope to hang himself, documenting his pattern of exploitation while building an irrefutable case for his character and methods. I would let Jake Morrison continue to believe that he was successfully manipulating the quiet, invisible data analyst who was so eager to help him succeed. And when the time came to reveal my true position at TechFlow, I would have months of evidence showing exactly why he was unsuited for leadership at a company built on Uncle David's principles of integrity and collaboration. But I also knew that this strategy carried personal risks. The more I helped Jake succeed, the more likely it became that our professional relationship would evolve into something more personal. Jake had already begun treating me differently than other colleagues, paying attention to my ideas and showing interest in my perspective in ways that felt like the beginning of romantic pursuit. I told myself I could manage those complications, that I was smart enough and strong enough to maintain appropriate boundaries while gathering the evidence I needed to protect TechFlow from Jake's influence. I had no idea how completely I would underestimate Jake Morrison's ability to manipulate not just my professional expertise, but my personal emotions as well. The revelation that would change everything came on a crisp December morning, exactly 3 weeks after I had officially become the owner of TechFlow Solutions. I was sitting at my desk, analyzing customer retention data for our Q4 reports, when Patricia Wells called my personal phone with news that would accelerate my timeline for revealing my position. "Emma, we need to meet today," Patricia said, her voice carrying an urgency I'd never heard before. Margaret Hawkins submitted a formal proposal to the Board of Advisors this morning. She wants to bring in outside investors and restructure TechFlow's ownership. My blood ran cold. Margaret had no authority to make such decisions without approval from the actual owner, but she didn't know I existed. As far as she understood, TechFlow was still operating under the interim leadership structure that had been in place since Uncle David's death, with the Board of Advisors serving as temporary oversight until ownership could be resolved. "What kind of restructuring?" I asked, stepping out of the main office area to take the call privately. "She's proposing to sell 40% of the company to Apex Capital Group, a private equity firm that specializes in marketing and technology acquisitions. The capital injection would fund expansion into new markets, but it would also fundamentally change TechFlow's culture and operational approach." I felt my stomach drop. Apex Capital Group had a reputation for acquiring promising companies, implementing aggressive cost-cutting measures, and maximizing short-term profits at the expense of employee satisfaction and long-term sustainability. It was exactly the kind of corporate takeover that Uncle David had feared, and precisely what his trust structure had been designed to prevent. "When is this being discussed?" I asked. "Emergency board meeting at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Margaret wants to move quickly, apparently because Apex has expressed serious interest but with a limited window for decision-making." I glanced at my watch. It was barely past 10 in the morning, which gave me less than 6 hours to decide whether to reveal my ownership and halt Margaret's proposal. The timing couldn't have been worse. I had planned to continue observing Jake's behavior for several more months, building a comprehensive case for his character before taking control of the company. But Margaret's proposal forced my hand. If I waited any longer, TechFlow might be legally committed to a partnership that would destroy everything Uncle David had built. "Patricia, I need you to prepare everything for an immediate ownership revelation. Full documentation, legal authority, the works. I'm calling an emergency meeting for 3:30. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Patricia asked gently. "Once you reveal your position, there's no going back to being the invisible analyst." I looked across the office at Jake Morrison, who was in Margaret's office for what appeared to be an intense strategic discussion. Through the glass walls, I could see him gesturing emphatically, clearly passionate about whatever proposal they were developing. "I'm ready," I said. "Uncle David trusted me with this responsibility, and I'm not going to let some private equity firm destroy his legacy." The next few hours were a whirlwind of preparation. I met Patricia at a coffee shop in South Austin, where she provided me with a complete legal brief on my ownership rights and the authority I would need to exercise to block Margaret's proposal. We reviewed the board structure, the decision-making processes, and the specific language I should use to assert my position. "Remember," Patricia said as we finished our preparation, "you have absolute authority to make this decision. The board serves in an advisory capacity only. Margaret has no legal standing to commit the company to any major financial arrangement without your explicit approval." I nodded, but my confidence was shaken by the magnitude of what I was about to do. In a few hours, I would walk into a room full of senior business leaders and reveal that the quiet data analyst they barely noticed was actually their boss. I would have to demonstrate authority I'd never exercised publicly, make decisions that would affect dozens of employees, and establish credibility with people who had years more experience than I did. But I also knew that Uncle David had prepared me for exactly this moment. Every conversation about values-based leadership, every lesson about long-term thinking over short-term profits, every example of how to maintain integrity under pressure, had been building toward this responsibility. At 3:15, I walked into TechFlow's main conference room carrying a leather portfolio that contained documentation of my ownership and legal authority. The board of advisors was already assembled, 4 respected business leaders from Austin's tech community who had agreed to provide interim oversight during the ownership transition period. Margaret Hawkins was there as well, clearly surprised to see me entering what she had expected to be a closed-door executive meeting. "Emma, I think there's been some confusion," Margaret said politely. "This is a board meeting to discuss strategic partnerships. I'm not sure why you're here." I took a seat at the head of the conference table, directly across from Margaret, and opened my portfolio. "Actually, Margaret, I'm here because I'm the owner of TechFlow Solutions, and I understand you've made a proposal that requires my approval." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret stared at me with undisguised shock, while the board members exchanged glances that ranged from confusion to recognition. Mr. Patterson, Uncle David's longtime friend and business advisor, was the first to speak. "Emma, are you saying that David's trust has been resolved?" he asked carefully. I pulled out the ownership documents and slid them across the table. The trust transferred controlling ownership to me on my 28th birthday, 6 weeks ago. I am now the majority shareholder of TechFlow Solutions, with full authority to make strategic and operational decisions. Margaret's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: disbelief, embarrassment, and what looked suspiciously like anger. "This is impossible. Why wasn't the board notified? Why didn't you reveal this information when it happened?" "Because I wanted to observe how the company was functioning before I assumed active leadership," I replied calmly. "I wanted to understand the current dynamics, assess potential challenges, and ensure that any changes I made would genuinely benefit TechFlow rather than simply asserting my authority." Mr. Patterson examined the documents briefly, then nodded to the other board members. "These appear to be in order. Emma, congratulations on your inheritance, and condolences again on David's passing. He would be proud to see you taking responsibility for his legacy." Margaret was clearly struggling to process this reversal. "Emma, I appreciate that this is a significant responsibility, but these kinds of strategic decisions require extensive experience and industry knowledge. The Apex Capital proposal represents a tremendous opportunity for growth and expansion." "Tell me about the proposal," I said, maintaining a professional tone despite my growing concern about Margaret's assumptions regarding my capabilities. For the next 20 minutes, Margaret presented her vision for TechFlow's partnership with Apex Capital Group. The proposal was comprehensive and professionally developed, with detailed financial projections and market analysis that demonstrated significant growth potential. But as Margaret spoke, I could see exactly why Uncle David had been concerned about industry changes and the pressure to prioritize short-term profits over long-term sustainability. Apex's involvement would bring substantial capital, but it would also introduce performance metrics and operational requirements that would fundamentally alter TechFlow's culture. The proposal called for aggressive expansion into new geographic markets, streamlined operational processes that would reduce employee benefits and flexibility, and restructured client relationships that prioritized volume over personalized service. It was a roadmap for transforming TechFlow from Uncle David's vision of ethical, relationship-based business into a conventional corporate entity focused primarily on maximizing investor returns. "What's the timeline for this decision?" I asked when Margaret finished her presentation. "Apex wants a commitment within 72 hours, Margaret replied. "They have other acquisition targets, and they're not willing to wait indefinitely for our decision." I looked around the table at the board members, all of whom were clearly waiting for my response. These were experienced business leaders who understood the financial benefits of Margaret's proposal, and they would probably recommend accepting Apex's offer if they were making the decision purely on economic grounds. But I wasn't making this decision purely on economic grounds. I was making it based on Uncle David's values and his vision for what TechFlow could become. "I'm rejecting the Apex Capital proposal," I said clearly. "TechFlow will remain privately held, and we will pursue growth strategies that align with our existing culture and values rather than external investor requirements." Margaret's shock was immediately replaced by frustration. "Emma, with all due respect, this decision could cost the company millions of dollars in lost opportunities. Are you prepared to take responsibility for that?" "Yes," I replied without hesitation. "I'm also prepared to take responsibility for preserving the kind of workplace culture that Uncle David died trying to protect." The meeting concluded with Margaret clearly unhappy, but legally unable to pursue the Apex partnership without my approval. The board members expressed support for my decision, while also offering to help me navigate the transition into active leadership. But the real confrontation was waiting for me in the hallway outside the conference room, where Jake Morrison was standing with an expression I'd never seen before. "Emma," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I need to talk to you." We walked to an empty office, and Jake closed the door behind us. When he turned to face me, his usual charm was completely absent, replaced by something that looked like betrayal and anger. "How long have you known?" he asked bluntly. "Known what?" "Don't play games with me. How long have you known that? You owned this company?" I met his gaze steadily. "Since my 28th birthday. 6 weeks." Jake stared at me for a long moment, clearly processing the implications. "So this entire time, while I've been working to build my career here, while I've been developing strategies and building relationships, you've been sitting there knowing that you could fire me at any moment." "I've been observing," I said simply, "learning how the company really functions, understanding what kind of leader I need to be." "And what have you concluded?" Jake asked, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. This was the moment I had been preparing for during months of watching Jake manipulate colleagues and appropriate other people's work. This was my opportunity to address his behavior directly, to explain why his approach to leadership was incompatible with TechFlow's values. But as I looked at Jake's face, seeing genuine hurt beneath his anger, I realized that the confrontation I had been anticipating would be more complicated than I had expected, because somewhere during the months of strategic observation and documentation, Jake Morrison had stopped being just a case study in workplace manipulation. He had become someone I cared about, despite knowing exactly who he really was. "I've concluded that you're extremely talented," I said carefully. "You're strategic, charismatic, and capable of driving real results. But I've also concluded that your approach to leadership is fundamentally incompatible with the kind of company Uncle David built. Jake's expression hardened. Because I'm ambitious? Because I work hard to advance my career? Because you advance your career by taking credit for other people's work, I replied. Because you build your reputation by repackaging insights and strategies that colleagues have developed. Because you treat people like resources to be exploited rather than partners to be respected. That's not true, Jake said, but his protest lacked conviction. Jake, I have documentation of dozens of instances where you've presented my analysis as your own strategic thinking. I've watched you do the same thing with Sarah's market research, Kevin's client retention strategies, and countless other contributions from people throughout this company. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him reassessing our entire relationship through the lens of my hidden ownership. Every conversation where I had provided insights and analysis, every moment where he had positioned himself as the beneficiary of my expertise, every interaction where he had treated me as a valuable but subordinate resource. So, what happens now? He asked finally. Now we figure out whether you're capable of changing your approach to leadership, or whether TechFlow needs different leadership for our sales division. Jake stared at me, clearly struggling with the complete reversal of power dynamics between us. The quiet analyst he had been cultivating as a source of strategic intelligence was actually his boss, with complete authority to determine his future at the company. Emma, I think I've been developing feelings for you, he said suddenly, his voice softer than it had been moments before. The admission caught me completely off guard. I had been prepared for anger, defensiveness, even resignation. I hadn't been prepared for Jake to introduce romantic feelings into an already complex professional situation. Jake, I don't think this is the right time to discuss personal relationships, I said carefully. When would be the right time? He asked. When you've decided whether to fire me? When you've determined whether I'm worthy of working for the company you inherited? There was genuine pain in his voice, and I realized that Jake's feelings were probably authentic, even if they had developed within the context of a fundamentally manipulative professional relationship. He had spent months getting to know me, learning to appreciate my intelligence and insights, even if he had been exploiting those qualities for his own advancement. I need time to think about all of this, I said. The ownership revelation. Your role at TechFlow. What kind of leadership structure we need going forward? Jake nodded, but his expression remained conflicted. Emma, whatever you decide about my professional future, I want you to know that my interest in you isn't strategic. It's not about advancing my career or gaining influence with the company. Owner, I genuinely care about you. I wanted to believe him, but I also knew that Jake was skilled enough at manipulation to make almost any statement sound authentic. More concerning, I realized that I wanted to believe him because my own feelings had become complicated during our months of professional interaction. Despite recognizing his exploitative behavior, despite documenting his pattern of taking credit for other people's work, I had developed genuine affection for Jake Morrison. I admired his intelligence, enjoyed his company, and found myself attracted to his confidence and charisma, even when I understood exactly how those qualities were being used to manipulate others. I need to focus on transitioning into my role as CEO, I said finally. Everything else will have to wait. Jake accepted this with a nod, but as he left the office, I could see that our conversation had fundamentally changed his understanding of our relationship. The dynamics that had seemed so clear when he thought he was cultivating a useful colleague had become infinitely more complex now that he knew I held ultimate authority over his professional future. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly Jake would adapt to this new reality, or how skillfully he would navigate the transition from manipulation-based exploitation to what appeared to be genuine romantic pursuit. Over the following weeks, as I began transitioning into active leadership of TechFlow Solutions, Jake's behavior toward me changed completely. Gone was the calculated charm and strategic positioning that had characterized our earlier interactions. Instead, he approached me with what seemed like authentic vulnerability and respect. He stopped appropriating other people's work and began explicitly crediting colleagues for their contributions. He restructured his client presentations to highlight team collaboration rather than individual expertise. He even apologized publicly for past instances where he had failed to acknowledge the sources of strategic insights and analysis. Most significantly, Jake began approaching me differently on a personal level. Instead of the confident, slightly condescending attention he had shown when he thought I was a useful subordinate, he now treated me with genuine deference and what appeared to be sincere romantic interest. He would bring me coffee in the mornings, not as a strategic gesture but as a thoughtful courtesy. He would ask about my transition into leadership, offering support and assistance without any apparent expectation of benefit. He would suggest dinner together, framing it as an opportunity to get to know each other better outside the complicated context of our professional relationship. And slowly, despite my better judgment and my extensive documentation of his previous behavior, I found myself responding to this new version of Jake Morrison. The transformation in Jake's behavior over the following months was so complete that I began to question my own judgment about his character. The man who had systematically appropriated colleagues' work and positioned himself as the indispensable center of every collaborative effort seemed to have genuinely evolved into someone who valued transparency, credited others' contributions, and approached leadership with humility rather than ego. By February, Jake had become my closest advisor in navigating the complexities of CEO responsibilities. When I struggled with budget allocations, he would offer thoughtful input without trying to dominate the decision-making process. When I faced difficult personnel decisions, he would provide perspective while making it clear that the final choice was entirely mine. When I felt overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility Uncle David had entrusted to me, Jake would listen with patience and offer encouragement without condescension. More troubling for my peace of mind, Jake had also become someone I genuinely enjoyed spending time with outside of work. Our professional dinners had evolved into actual dates, quiet evenings where we talked about books and travel, and dreams that had nothing to do with TechFlow Solutions. He was intelligent, funny, and surprisingly vulnerable when he wasn't performing for an audience. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jake told me one evening in early March, as we sat on the rooftop patio of a restaurant overlooking Lady Bird Lake, about how I used to take credit for other people's work. I had been wondering when this conversation would happen. Despite Jake's changed behavior, we had never directly addressed the pattern of exploitation I had documented during his first months at TechFlow. "You were right," he continued, his voice quiet but steady. "I did build my reputation by repackaging other people's insights. I convinced myself it was collaboration, but it was really just strategic theft." The admission was more honest than I had expected, and I found myself wanting to minimize his self-criticism rather than reinforce it. "People make mistakes," I said carefully. "What matters is whether you learn from them." Jake looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "Do you think people can really change, Emma? Or do we just get better at hiding who we really are?" It was a question that went straight to the heart of my uncertainty about our relationship. Had Jake genuinely evolved into a better leader and partner, or had he simply adapted his manipulation techniques to account for my position as CEO? Was his apparent vulnerability authentic, or was it just a more sophisticated approach to getting what he wanted? "I think people can change," I said finally. "But I also think change requires acknowledging who you used to be and making conscious choices to be different." "Then I want you to know who I used to be," Jake said, leaning forward slightly. "I used to see relationships as strategic opportunities. I used to evaluate people based on what they could do for my career. I used to think that success meant being the smartest person in the room, even if that meant diminishing everyone else." He paused, then continued with what sounded like genuine Regret. I did all of those things with you, Emma. I approached you because I recognized that you had insights that could make me look brilliant. I cultivated our professional relationship because I thought your expertise would accelerate my advancement at TechFlow. I was using you, and I'm ashamed of that. The honesty was both painful and liberating. For months, I had been trying to reconcile my growing feelings for Jake with my knowledge of his manipulative behavior. Hearing him acknowledge and take responsibility for that behavior made it easier to believe that the person I was falling in love with was real, rather than just another performance. What changed? I asked. Jake smiled, and for the first time since I had known him, it seemed completely genuine. You did. Not because you turned out to be the CEO, but because you made me want to be worthy of your respect. I started paying attention to how you treated people, how you made decisions, how you balanced ambition with integrity. I realized I wanted to be the kind of person who deserved to be with someone like you. That night, for the first time since Uncle David's death, I felt genuinely optimistic about both TechFlow's future and my own. Jake and I had built something that felt authentic and sustainable, a relationship based on mutual respect rather than strategic manipulation. I had successfully transitioned into CEO responsibilities without compromising the company's culture or values. Our client base was growing, our employees were thriving, and I was finally beginning to feel worthy of the trust Uncle David had placed in me. I should have known it was too good to last. The Meridian Industries deal that would make Jake a star and ultimately destroy our relationship began in earnest that spring. Meridian was exactly the kind of client Uncle David would have loved. A mid-sized healthcare technology company that was genuinely trying to improve patient outcomes through innovative software solutions. They needed help reaching healthcare. Providers who could benefit from their platform and their values aligned perfectly with TechFlow's commitment to ethical business practices. Jake threw himself into the Meridian proposal with an intensity I had never seen before. He spent weeks researching their industry, understanding their competitive challenges, and developing a marketing strategy that would position them for sustainable growth rather than just short-term revenue spikes. What made his approach even more impressive was how collaborative it had become. Instead of mining colleagues for insights he could present as his own, Jake was explicitly building on other people's expertise and making sure they received appropriate credit for their contributions. Sarah's research on healthcare decision-making processes is going to be crucial for this pitch, he told me during one of our evening strategy sessions. And your demographic analysis of rural healthcare markets could be the key to helping Meridian reach underserved communities. I was proud of Jake's evolution and excited about the potential impact we could have on Meridian's mission. This felt like the kind of project Uncle David would have considered a perfect example of how ethical business practices could drive both social good and financial success. The presentation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in mid-May, and Jake spent the weekend beforehand rehearsing his pitch and refining the supporting materials. I offered to help with preparation, but he insisted he wanted to handle this one independently. I need to prove to myself that I can succeed based on my own work rather than appropriating other people's insights, he said. This is my chance to show that I've actually changed. I respected his desire for independence, but I also provided him with comprehensive market analysis and strategic recommendations that could strengthen his proposal if he chose to use them. I framed it as background information rather than required material, making it clear that how he used the research was entirely his decision. The Meridian presentation was a triumph beyond anything TechFlow had achieved before. Jake delivered a sophisticated, insightful pitch that demonstrated deep understanding of their business challenges and offered creative solutions that addressed both immediate needs and long-term growth opportunities. But what impressed me most was how he handled questions from Meridian's executive team. Instead of deflecting or improvising, Jake answered with genuine expertise that could only have come from thorough research and careful analysis. When they asked about market trends that hadn't been covered in his formal presentation, He provided detailed responses that showed he truly understood their industry landscape. The Meridian executives were clearly impressed, and by the end of the meeting, they were talking about partnership terms rather than simply evaluating our proposal. It was the kind of success that would transform TechFlow's reputation and establish us as a premier strategic partner for healthcare technology companies. After the meeting, as we walked back to our office building, Jake was more animated than I had ever seen him. "Emma, this could change everything for us," he said, his excitement infectious. "Not just the revenue, though that's obviously important, but the kind of impact we could have, the businesses we could help grow, the problems we could help solve." I was caught up in his enthusiasm, both for the professional opportunity and for what this success meant for our relationship. Jake had proven that he could achieve remarkable results through genuine collaboration and ethical leadership. He had demonstrated growth not just in his professional capabilities, but in his character and values. That evening, we celebrated at the same rooftop restaurant where Jake had confessed his past mistakes and his commitment to change. But this time, instead of discussing personal growth and professional challenges, we talked about our future together. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Jake said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "For TechFlow, but also for us." I felt a flutter of anticipation, wondering if Jake was about to propose, or suggest moving in together, or simply planning our next vacation. "I love you, Emma," he continued, his voice warm and certain. "I love your intelligence, your integrity, your commitment to building something meaningful rather than just profitable. I want to spend my life supporting your vision and being worthy of your partnership." It was everything I had hoped to hear, a declaration that seemed to validate both Jake's transformation and my decision to trust him despite his problematic history. I was ready to respond with my own confession of love when Jake's expression shifted slightly. "But I've also been thinking about what's best for TechFlow's future," he said, his tone becoming more serious. "And I think we need to consider expanding our leadership team." The change in subject felt abrupt, but I was curious about Jake's strategic thinking. Since becoming CEO, I had been wondering about whether TechFlow needed additional senior leadership to support our growth. "What do you have in mind?" I asked. "I think TechFlow needs a chief operating officer," Jake said. "Someone who can handle day-to-day operations while you focus on strategic vision and long-term planning." It was a reasonable suggestion, and I appreciated that Jake was thinking about organizational structure and sustainable growth, rather than just immediate success. "Any thoughts on who might be qualified for that role?" I asked. Jake smiled, and something in his expression made me suddenly wary. "Actually, I think I might be the right person for that position. My experience with client relations, strategic planning, and team coordination makes me uniquely qualified to support your leadership while managing operational responsibilities." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. In one smooth transition, Jake had moved from declaring his love to proposing his own promotion to the second most powerful position in the company. The romantic moment I had been anticipating had become a professional negotiation disguised as relationship planning. "Jake, I don't think this is the right time to discuss organizational restructuring," I said carefully. "When would be the right time?" he asked, echoing his earlier question about discussing personal relationships. "Emma, I love you, but I also have professional ambitions. I want to build a future with you, but that future needs to include opportunities for me to grow and advance within TechFlow." The calculation behind his timing was suddenly obvious. Jake had waited until after his major success with Meridian Industries to leverage both his professional achievement and our personal relationship into a promotion that would give him significant authority within the company. "I need to think about this," I said, my enthusiasm for our celebration rapidly diminishing. "Of course," Jake replied smoothly. "I just wanted you to know that I'm ready for additional responsibility, and I think our personal relationship actually makes me more qualified to serve as your strategic partner in running TechFlow." The drive home was quiet, with both of us lost in our own thoughts. But that night, lying in bed and replaying our conversation, I realized that Jake Morrison hadn't actually changed as much as I had wanted to believe. He had become more sophisticated in his approach, more subtle in his manipulation, and more strategic in his timing. But the fundamental pattern was still there. Jake identified opportunities to advance his position, cultivated relationships that could benefit his career, and leveraged personal connections to gain professional advantages. The only difference was that now his target was me, and the prize was not just recognition or bonuses, but actual ownership stake in the company Uncle David had built. 3 days later, the text message that would end our relationship arrived. While I was drinking coffee and watching the sunrise, exactly as I had been doing on the morning Jake joined TechFlow 18 months earlier. The notification sound still cut through the morning air like a blade, but this time I was prepared for what I might find. Jake's dismissive breakup message was devastating, but it wasn't surprising. I had been expecting something like this since our conversation about his promotion aspirations. What I hadn't expected was how quickly Jake would move to assert his independence and professional authority. Within hours of sending the breakup text, he had scheduled meetings with key clients, positioned himself as TechFlow's primary strategic leader, and begun distancing himself from any appearance of being influenced by personal relationships with company ownership. But Jake Morrison had made the same crucial miscalculation that had doomed his manipulation from the beginning. He thought he understood the power dynamics at TechFlow, but he had never grasped the full extent of my authority or the legal protections Uncle David had built into the company's structure. 2 days after receiving Jake's breakup text, I called Ms. Rodriguez to schedule an emergency board meeting, not to discuss Jake's employment status, which was entirely within my discretion as CEO, but to address a larger issue that his behavior had revealed. "I need to restructure TechFlow's executive compensation and promotion policies," I told Ms. Rodriguez. "I want to ensure that leadership advancement is based on long-term commitment to company values rather than short-term performance metrics or personal relationships." "Are you planning to terminate Mr. Morrison?" she asked directly. "I'm planning to demonstrate that leadership at TechFlow requires integrity, collaboration, and genuine commitment to our mission rather than strategic positioning and personal ambition." The board meeting I called for that Friday afternoon was unlike any TechFlow had ever held. Instead of discussing financial performance or strategic partnerships, I was presenting a comprehensive case study in workplace manipulation and the importance of values-based leadership. I had spent months documenting Jake's behavior, not because I was planning to use it against him, but because I wanted to understand how exploitation functioned within organizations that prided themselves on ethical practices. Now that documentation would serve a different purpose. Over the past 18 months, I've observed a pattern of behavior that represents everything TechFlow stands against, I told the assembled board members. Strategic appropriation of colleagues' work, manipulation of personal relationships for professional gain, and treatment of company culture as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a foundation to be protected. I presented my evidence methodically. Emails where Jake had presented other people's insights as his own strategic thinking, meeting notes that showed how he had systematically positioned himself as the indispensable coordinator of collaborative efforts, and recordings of conversations where he had explicitly discussed using personal relationships to advance his professional position. The most concerning aspect of this behavior, I continued, is how sophisticated and subtle it had become. This wasn't obvious plagiarism or crude manipulation. This was strategic exploitation disguised as collaboration and relationship building. Mr. Patterson, who had been silent throughout my presentation, finally spoke. "Emma, what outcome are you seeking from this meeting?" I want the board to understand that protecting TechFlow's culture requires vigilance against exactly this kind of behavior, regardless of short-term performance results or personal relationships with leadership. And Mr. Morrison's employment? I paused, thinking about Uncle David's letter and his advice about using underestimation to my advantage. Jake had spent 18 months underestimating my character, my resolve, and my commitment to the principles Uncle David had died protecting. Mr. Morrison's employment will be terminated immediately, with appropriate severance, but no recommendation, for future positions. The board meeting concluded with unanimous support for my decision and approval of new policies designed to prevent similar manipulation in the future. But the real confrontation was still waiting. Jake was in his office when I returned to TechFlow that afternoon, probably preparing for client meetings and strategic presentations that he would never give. Through the glass walls, I could see him reviewing documents with the focused intensity that had initially impressed me about his work ethic. I knocked on his door and entered without waiting for permission. "Jake, we need to talk." He looked up with surprise, clearly not expecting to see me after his abrupt breakup text. "Emma, I thought we agreed that personal relationships were becoming too complicated for professional collaboration." "This isn't about our personal relationship," I said, sitting down across from his desk. "This is about your employment at TechFlow Solutions." Something in my tone must have warned him, because Jake's expression immediately became guarded. "I've called a board meeting to address your pattern of manipulation and exploitation during your time at this company," I continued. "Your employment is being terminated immediately." Jake stared at me for a long moment, clearly processing what I had just said. "You're firing me because I broke up with you?" "I'm firing you because you spent 18 months systematically appropriating other people's work, manipulating colleagues for personal gain, and treating TechFlow's culture as an obstacle to your advancement rather than a foundation to be protected." "That's not true," Jake protested, but his denial lacked the conviction it would have had months earlier. "Jake, I have documentation of dozens of instances where you presented my analysis as your own strategic thinking. I have records of meetings where you positioned yourself as the source of insights that colleagues had developed. I have evidence of conversations where you explicitly discussed using personal relationships to advance your professional position." The fight went out of Jake's expression as he realized the extent of what I had been observing and documenting. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked quietly. "I started documenting your behavior during your first month at TechFlow, when I realized you represented exactly the kind of leadership Uncle David had warned me about. I continued documenting because I wanted to understand how manipulation functioned within organizations and because I hoped you might genuinely change." "And the relationship? Our personal connection?" I thought carefully about how to answer that question honestly. "My feelings for you were genuine, Jake. Despite knowing exactly who you were and how you operated, I developed real affection for you. I wanted to believe that people could change, that you could become the person you seemed to be becoming. But you never really trusted me." "I trusted the person you appeared to be evolving into. I didn't trust the person you had proven yourself to be." Jake nodded slowly, and for the first time since I had known him, he seemed completely without calculation or strategy. "What happens now? Now you pack your personal belongings and leave TechFlow Solutions. Security will escort you out. Your access has been revoked, and you'll receive appropriate severance through HR. And personally?" I stood up, preparing to leave his office for the last time. "Personally, Jake, I hope you learned something from this experience. I hope you figure out how to build genuine relationships and achieve authentic success rather than just strategic positioning and manipulation." As I reached the door, Jake called my name one more time. "Emma, for what it's worth, I did love you. Maybe not in the right way, maybe not for the right reasons, but my feelings were real." I turned back to look at him, this man who had shown me both the worst and best possibilities of romantic and professional relationships. "I know," I said softly. That's what made this so difficult. 6 months later, TechFlow Solutions was thriving beyond anything Uncle David could have imagined. The Meridian Industries contract had led to partnerships with 3 other healthcare technology companies. Our employee satisfaction scores were the highest in Austin's tech industry, and we had been recognized as one of the most ethical and innovative marketing firms in Texas. I kept Uncle David's photo on my desk, not as a memorial, but as a reminder of the principles that had guided TechFlow from a garage startup to a company that proved ethical leadership could drive both social impact and financial success. And sometimes, late at night in my downtown office, I would think about Jake Morrison and wonder if he had learned anything from his experience at TechFlow. I hoped he had found a way to channel his intelligence and ambition into genuine value, creation rather than strategic exploitation. But mostly, I focused on building the future Uncle David had envisioned. A company that treated people with dignity, delivered authentic value to clients, and proved that success didn't require compromising your values or exploiting your relationships. The quiet, invisible data analyst that Jake had dismissed via text message had become exactly the kind of leader Uncle David had always believed she could be. And that, more than any personal vindication or professional triumph, felt like the most important success of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.